Vernon Boone rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878 with $40 in his pocket, a good horse beneath him, and an offer that not a single woman in 4 counties had ever refused. Until the day he met Inez Ramsey standing behind the counter of her father's dry goods store with flour on her apron and fire in her dark eyes. He had not meant to stop in Caldwell at all. He had meant to push through to Wichita, where a man named Garrett was holding a contract for him to sign on a cattle drive heading north toward Dodge City. But his horse had thrown a shoe just outside of town, and the blacksmith shop sat 2 doors down from Ramsey's dry goods and general merchandise, which meant Vernon had 30 minutes to kill while old Sam Pickering reshod his roan mare. He had wandered into the store because he needed tobacco and perhaps a tin of peaches, and he had walked out 45 minutes later with neither, completely forgetting about both, because the woman behind the counter had occupied every corner of his attention in a way he had not prepared for. He remembered the exact moment it happened. He had laid 3 coins on the wooden counter and asked for a tin of peaches and a pouch of loose tobacco, and she had looked up from her ledger book with those dark eyes and said, perfectly politely, "The peaches are on the 2nd shelf, 3rd row. The tobacco is in the jar beside the window. Help yourself and bring them up when you are ready." She had then looked back down at her ledger as though he were no more interesting than a post. Vernon Boone was 28 years old at the time, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with a jaw that women in 3 territories had called handsome, and a reputation for charm that preceded him like a well-thrown rope. He was not accustomed to being dismissed, not unkindly, not with irritation, just simply cleanly, with the same energy one might use to redirect a mildly inconvenient fly. He had gone and fetched the peaches and the tobacco. He had come back to the counter. He had tried again. "I don't believe I caught your name," he said, setting the items down and offering his best smile. She glanced up again briefly. "I don't believe I gave it." She wrote something in the ledger. "That will be 42 cents. He paid. He left. He rode to Wichita on his reshod mare and signed the cattle contract, and he thought about that woman every single mile of the journey north. Her name, he learned later from Sam Pickering the blacksmith, who had a gift for gossip that rivaled any woman Vernon had ever met, was Inez Ramsey. She was 25 years old, the eldest daughter of Harold Ramsey, who had come out to Kansas from Tennessee in 1869 with a wagon full of goods and a determination to build something lasting. Harold had built the store. His wife, Clara, had built the community around it. When Clara Ramsey died of fever in the winter of 1875, Inez had stepped into that store and taken over the books, the inventory, the ordering, and the running of the whole enterprise with a quiet competence that had earned her the respect of every rancher, farmer, and trail hand within 30 miles of Caldwell. She was, Sam told Vernon over the sound of hammer on anvil, not particularly interested in being courted. Several men had tried. The Reverend's son had tried twice. A cattle baron from down near the Texas border had sent her a letter that Sam himself had seen, and which, Sam said, had included a rather substantial financial proposition. Inez had returned it with a polite note of declination and gone back to her ledger. Vernon stored all of this information away carefully, the way a man stores kindling for a fire he intends to build. He came back to Caldwell 6 months later, in the autumn of 1878, after the cattle drive had paid out, and he had pocketed a season's worth of honest wages. He had thought about what to offer her. He had thought about it with more deliberate attention than he had given to any cattle contract, any land purchase, any business arrangement in his entire life. He rode into town with his hat brushed clean and a specific proposition forming in his mind. He went to the store. She was behind the counter as he had somehow known she would be. She looked up when the bell above the door rang, and there was no recognition in her face for a moment, and then a small, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes that told him she did remember him after all. "Mr. Boone," she said, not warmly, not coldly, simply accurately. He was genuinely surprised. "You remember my name." Sam Pickering told me your name after you left in April, she said, returning her attention to a bolt of blue calico she was measuring. He mentioned you might come back. Sam talks a great deal. I've noticed. He set his hat on the counter, which felt presumptuous even as he did it. I've come to make you a proper offer, Miss Ramsey. She cut the calico with clean, decisive scissors. I appreciate the warning. She said it without looking up, and there was something so perfectly dry in her tone that Vernon laughed before he could stop himself. She did look up then briefly, and something passed across her face, amusement, quickly contained. He made his offer. It was a good offer. He had done well on the drive, had saved enough to put a down payment on a 40-acre plot south of town. He described the land, described his plans for a modest house, described his intentions toward her in terms that were respectful and direct and financially sound. He was, he told her, a man with prospects and the intention to settle down. He thought she was the finest woman he had encountered in his considerable years of travel, and he would be honored to call her his wife. She listened to all of it. She folded the calico. She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Mr. Boone, I appreciate that you've thought this through, but I don't know you. I don't know what kind of man you are in a hard winter or a dry summer or when things don't go as planned. A plot of land and good intentions are not enough for me. I am sorry." He picked up his hat. He looked at her for a long moment. "That's fair," he said, because it was. He left. He did not slam the door. He did not argue or press. He simply walked out, mounted his mare, and rode back toward his rented room at the Caldwell boarding house, where he sat on the edge of his bed for a long while thinking about what she had said. She wanted to know what kind of man he was in a hard winter. She wanted to know who he was when things did not go as planned. It was, he thought, the most honest reason anyone had ever given him for anything. He could not argue with it. He did not want to. What he wanted, with a clarity that surprised him considerably, was to show her. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was one of the hardest Kansas had seen in a decade. The snow came in November and did not ease until March, and the cold was the kind that crept under every door and window frame and sat in a man's bones even beside a fire. The cattle that were not moved south in time suffered badly, and several ranches along the border lost whole portions of their herds. Harold Ramsey's dry goods store became a critical lifeline for families who could not get to town regularly, and Inez managed the store's supplies with a careful, almost military precision, making sure that no single family took more than what would leave others without. Vernon Boone spent that winter in Caldwell because he had nowhere more pressing to be. He worked for a rancher named Dutch Hollowell, whose spread sat 5 miles east of town, doing the work of keeping livestock alive in brutal conditions. He mended fences buried in snow. He helped drive cattle into sheltered draws. He broke ice on water troughs in temperatures that made his hands ache for hours afterward. He did not complain about any of it, because the work needed doing and Dutch needed help, and it was honest labor. What he did not advertise was that every Friday, when he rode into Caldwell for supplies, he stopped at Ramsey's store. He bought what he needed. He exchanged civil words with Inez. He noticed the tiredness around her eyes and the careful way she tracked the inventory, writing numbers in that ledger with the same focus a general might give to a battlefield map. One Friday in January, 2 months into the worst of the winter, he came into the store and found her in a visible state of distress, though she was containing it with considerable effort. She was standing at the back wall staring at an empty shelf where the flour sacks should have been, and the expression on her face was one of a woman working through a serious problem. He set his list on the counter and waited. "The supply wagon from Wichita didn't come," she said, without turning around. She seemed to know he was there by some instinct. "3rd week. The roads are too bad. I have 17 families counting on flour and cornmeal before Sunday. I have 4 sacks remaining." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "Dutch Hollowell has a supply of cornmeal. He ordered extra in October because he thought it might come to this. I can talk to him tonight." She turned then and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, not quite surprise, something more careful than that. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because 17 families need cornmeal," he said simply. "And because you're the one who's been keeping track of that all winter and you shouldn't have to figure it out alone." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "I'll pay Dutch Hollowell a fair price. I'll tell him that." He picked up his list. "He'll appreciate it. Dutch is a fair man." He arranged it. Dutch gave up half his cornmeal stores at a price that was fair to everyone, and Vernon hauled it into town on a sled because the wagon wheels were useless in the snow. He arrived at the store on a Saturday morning with the cornmeal and helped Inez carry it in and stack it on the empty shelves, and they worked side by side in the cold back room without talking much. But there was something easy about the silence that neither of them commented on. When they were done, she put the kettle on the small iron stove in the back room and made coffee, which she had never offered him before, and they stood with their cups and looked at the stacked cornmeal sacks. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said. "You could have just sent word." "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're making it very difficult to hold a fixed opinion of you, Mr. Boone." Smiled into his coffee. "That's the general idea." She did not smile back, but the corners of her mouth moved in a way that he decided to count as progress. The spring of 1879 arrived eventually, as springs do in Kansas, slowly at first and then all at once, the snow retreating into the draws and the grass greening up overnight. Vernon finished his winter work with Dutch Hollowell, pocketed his wages, and gave serious thought to what to do next. He could take another cattle drive north. There was always work in that direction. A man with his experience could find trail boss positions, not just droving work. He had the skills and the reputation. He stayed in Caldwell. He put his wages together with what he had saved from the previous drive, and went to see a man named Calhoun who held the deed on a piece of land just south of town, 160 acres of good grassland with a creek running along the east edge. The land was more than he had originally planned to purchase, but after a winter of watching what it meant to have resources rather than just enough, he had adjusted his thinking. He bought the land. It took almost everything he had saved. He did not tell Inez. He was not buying the land to impress her or to make another offer. He was buying it because it was good land, and he intended to build a life on it regardless of what she decided. But he was aware, in the honest corner of his thinking, that he wanted the life he built to be one she might want to be part of. Through the spring and early summer of 1879, Vernon worked his land. He broke ground for a house, not a soddy but a proper frame house, modest but well built, because he was good with his hands and because he had grown up helping his father frame buildings in Missouri before the war had taken his father away and changed everything. He worked the framing himself on weekdays, and on weekends he hired a couple of young men from town named Louis Corrals and Andrew Fitch to help him raise the walls. Louis Corrals was 18 years old, the son of a Mexican family who had settled outside Caldwell before the town was much of anything. His father, Ernesto, ran a small but well-regarded horse-breaking operation, and Louis had inherited both his father's way with horses and his father's quick, decisive intelligence. He was good company on a work site and not afraid of hard labor. It was Louis who mentioned one evening, while they were nailing down flooring boards as the sun went low, that Inez Ramsey's father had been ill since the spring. "Nothing serious yet," Louis said, reaching for another nail. "But he is not the same as last year. Miss Inez does all the heavy lifting in the store now." "All of it?" Vernon did not look up from his work. "Is she managing it?" "She is managing everything," Louis said with a tone that suggested the answer was both yes and obviously. "But managing everything alone is hard on a person." Vernon thought about that through the evening and into the night. The next morning he went to the store. Harold Ramsey was there, sitting in a chair near the back with a lap blanket and a cup of tea, and he looked older than his years and tired in a way that a winter's rest had not corrected. He was still sharp-eyed, and he greeted Vernon with the cordial directness of a man who had always known exactly what he thought of people. "Boone," he said. "I hear you bought the Calhoun land." "Yes, sir. Good land." Harold sipped his tea. "You building, got the frame up, should have the roof on by late summer." Harold nodded approvingly. A man who builds something solid knows who he is. He looked at Vernon with those steady eyes that were so much like his daughter's. "You still interested in my Inez?" Vernon did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the front of the store, where Inez was lifting a sack of grain that was clearly too heavy and managing it anyway with the expression of someone who had decided long ago that there was no point in waiting for help. "Yes, sir," he said. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a good woman, the best I know. But she's got her mother's particular way of thinking, which means she will not be rushed or cornered, and she will not be convinced by anything that isn't real. You'd better be real, son." "I'm trying to be," Vernon said. He went and lifted the grain sack from Inez's arms before she could protest, carried it to where it needed to go, and set it down without making a production of it. She looked at him with that evaluating expression she had. "I had it. I know," he said. "Where do you need the next one?" She studied him for a moment, then pointed to the shelf. They moved the inventory together in a comfortable silence that felt, to Vernon, like something being built one piece at a time. The summer of 1879 moved along in the way Kansas summers do, hot and bright, and occasionally violent, with thunderstorms that rolled in from the west with the sound of approaching armies. Vernon's house progressed steadily. By July, he had the roof on, and by August, he had the interior walls plastered and the fireplace completed, a solid stone chimney that drew well and would be a considerable comfort in winters to come. He visited the store regularly now, not awkwardly but naturally, and Inez had stopped treating him with polite reserve and begun treating him with something that felt like genuine comfort. They talked easily when there was time for talking, about the town, about the news that came up from Wichita and down from Dodge City, about the families in the area, and who was doing well and who was struggling, about books, because Inez read widely and had opinions about what she read that were sharp and frequently surprising. He found himself watching for the moments when she would say something unexpected. She had a mind that operated with a particular kind of precision, cutting to the center of an idea the way she cut fabric on her counter, without waste. He had met clever women before, but Inez's intelligence was not performative. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply thinking always, and the things she thought were worth hearing. He told her this one afternoon in August when they were sitting on the porch step outside the store during the quiet part of the afternoon, eating apples because she had a crate of them from a nearby farm, and she had offered him one with the same unstudied naturalness of someone sharing food with a person they trusted. "You're the most straightforwardly intelligent person I know," he said. She looked at him. "That's a strange compliment." "I don't mean it as strange. I mean you think well and you don't make a show of it, and you're usually right, which is a combination I haven't encountered often." She bit into her apple and looked out at the main street of Caldwell, where a wagon was raising dust and two dogs were investigating something interesting under the boardwalk. "My mother was like that," she said after a moment. She knew things, she knew people. She could read a situation the way you'd read a page, and she was almost always right about what she read. She paused. "I've tried to be like her." "It doesn't always work." "What doesn't work?" "The knowing things part." She turned and looked at him, and for a moment her expression was open in a way he had not seen before. "I know numbers well. I know inventory. I know what families need and what they can afford, but I don't always know people the way she did. I'm careful about that." He thought he understood then. She was being careful about him. Carefully watching, carefully measuring, the way she measured fabric and weighed grain, making sure before she committed to anything that she had the right count. He was glad she was careful. He intended to give her accurate numbers. The autumn of 1879 came, and the store was busier than ever as families stocked up in preparation for what everyone hoped would be a milder winter than the last. Harold Ramsey's health had stabilized but not improved, and Inez managed the store entirely alone now, hiring a young woman named Pearl Gantry 2 mornings a week to help with the heavier work. One October afternoon, a man rode into Caldwell who Vernon did not know but who clearly knew the territory. He was well dressed for a cattleman, wearing a coat that had been made somewhere better than Kansas, and he rode a horse that had cost more than most homesteaders earned in a year. His name, Vernon learned quickly from the way people in the street greeted him, was Ellison Chalk. He was a cattle baron from down near the border, the kind of man whose name appeared in the newspapers sometimes when there were disputes about grazing rights or water access, or the slow, complex business of cattle being driven through land that was increasingly being fenced in. Ellison Chalk went into Ramsey's store. He came out 20 minutes later with his expression neutral, but his jaw set in a way Vernon recognized as a man who had not got the answer he wanted. He mounted his horse and rode back down the main street and out of town, and that was the last anyone in Caldwell saw of him for several months. Vernon waited until the following morning to go to the store. He was not about to make a scene about another man calling on Inez, because she was not his to protect and he was not the kind of man who made scenes. But he was curious. She told him before he could ask, which he appreciated. She was cataloging a new shipment of goods when he came in, and she said without looking up, "That was Ellison Chalk yesterday. You probably heard he came in." "I heard," Vernon said, leaning against the counter. "He offered to buy the store, my father's store." She said it flatly, without visible emotion, but he could see the tightness in her hands where they held the clipboard. "He said the building is in a good location and he could use it as a supply depot for his operations." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the store is not for sale." She looked up then. He seemed surprised. "He said he'd make it worth our while." "And?" "I told him the store was built by my father and it will belong to my family as long as there is a Ramsey alive who wants to run it." Her chin was up slightly. He did not seem accustomed to being told no. Vernon looked at her steadily. "Neither was I the first time," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not the quick containment he usually saw, but something more genuine, warmer. "No," she said, "you weren't." And then to his considerable surprise she smiled. A real smile, full and bright, and it transformed her face entirely, the way light changes a landscape. He was quiet for a moment because that smile had done something to him that he needed a second to recover from. "I'll make sure Chalk understands the situation," he said. "I can handle Ellison Chalk myself, Vernon." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable but aware. "I know you can," he said carefully. "I just wanted to say it." She looked back at her clipboard, but she was still almost smiling. "I'll add it to the ledger," she said, "under things that were said." He rode home to his newly finished house that evening in a state of considerable happiness that he felt slightly embarrassed about, and decided to simply enjoy rather than analyze. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was kinder than the previous one, though still cold in the way Kansas winters always were, settling into the bones and requiring careful tending of fires and livestock. Vernon had cattle now, a small herd he had purchased in the fall, nothing grand, 20 head of good solid stock that he intended to build from. He also had 12 horses in a partnership arrangement with Ernesto Corrals, who had agreed that the land Vernon owned and the corrals he had built were a good complement to Ernesto's horse-breaking skills. It was a sensible arrangement that benefited both families and that Vernon had approached Ernesto about directly and honestly, because he respected the man, and because Lewis had told him once, without any editorial, that his father valued men who looked him in the eye. He visited the store through the winter, and he visited the Ramsey house at the back of the store sometimes when Harold invited him in for an evening of conversation. And slowly, in the way that things build when they are built right, He became part of the fabric of the Ramsey household without any single dramatic moment announcing it. Harold liked him. Pearl Gantry, who worked mornings and had the particular sharp-eyed assessment of a 20-year-old woman who had decided she understood human nature, told him once while she was sweeping the porch that Inez talked about him when he wasn't there. "Does she?" Vernon said, working to keep his expression appropriately restrained. "She says you are more capable than you let on," Pearl said, which was a specific enough observation that he knew it had come directly from Inez. He filed it away with great satisfaction. The spring of 1880 arrived, and with it his first full year of owning and working his land. He had survived the winter with all 20 of his cattle alive and had bought 10 more in March. His arrangement with Ernesto was prospering. The house was solid and warm, and he had furnished it with care, buying pieces from the store when they came in from the east, and occasionally making things himself in the evenings. A table, some shelves, a small bookcase because he had noticed what Inez valued and he was thinking about the future. On a warm April morning, Vernon Boone cleaned up more carefully than usual, put on his best shirt, brushed his hat, and rode into Caldwell to make Inez Ramsey his second offer. She was measuring rope when he came in, coiling it with the quick efficiency of someone who has measured rope 1,000 times. She looked up at the bell over the door and read his face with those perceptive dark eyes and went very still for a moment. "Mr. Boone," she said, very quietly. "Miss Ramsey." He set his hat on the counter, which by now felt like a gesture she recognized, and he stood up straight and looked at her. "I've been on this land for a year now. I've got 30 cattle and a horse partnership with Ernesto Corrals that is doing well. I've got a house with a fireplace that draws perfectly, and a bookcase I built myself because I thought it might come in useful someday. I've spent the better part of 2 years trying to show you what kind of man I am in a hard winter and a dry summer, and when things don't go as planned, and I believe I have shown you a fair accounting." He paused. "I would like to ask you to marry me, Inez." She had set down the rope. She was watching him with an expression that was not the polite reserve she had worn in the beginning, and not the careful evaluation of the middle months. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those. "Why me?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than he expected. He thought about it, not because he did not know, but because she deserved the real answer and not the quick one. "Because you are the only person I've known who made me want to be worth knowing," he said. "Because you're honest and capable and you care about people without making a drama out of it, and because talking to you is the best part of most days, and because when you smiled at me in October I went home in a state of happiness I still haven't fully recovered from." Something moved in her eyes. She looked down at the counter for a moment, and he could see the careful thinking happening, and he waited because he had learned to wait for her. When she looked up, her expression had settled into something clear and certain. "I need to talk to my father first," she said. "Of course," he said. "Wait here." She went through to the back of the store where Harold spent his mornings, and Vernon stood at the counter and looked out the front window at Caldwell's Main Street and breathed carefully and waited. She was gone for 11 minutes. He counted them with the clock on the wall behind the counter. When she came back, her expression was composed, but her eyes were bright in a way they had not been before, and she came around the counter and stood in front of him, closer than she usually stood, close enough that he could see the small scar on her chin that she had told him once came from a childhood fall. "My father says," she said, "that you are a real man and that he knows it because you never once tried to convince me. You just tried to be what you were." She looked up at him. "He's right." Vernon's throat was doing something inconvenient. He managed to speak past it. "Is that a yes?" "Yes, Vernon," she said, and the way she said his name was different from any way she had said anything before. Soft, sure. "It is a yes." He stood very still for one suspended moment, and then he took her hands in his and she let him, and they stood like that in the morning light coming through the store window, and it was the simplest and most profound thing that had happened to him in all his 29 years. He had not kissed her yet. That would come later, he thought, when it came naturally. For now it was enough to stand there with her hands in his and feel the truth of the moment settle around them both. "I'll need to keep running the store," she said, and her voice was practical but her hands were warm and she had not let go. "Father needs the income and I won't leave him without help." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to. We'll work it out." "We will," she agreed, and the certainty in her voice felt like a door opening. Harold Ramsey, when Vernon came through to speak with him properly and ask for his blessing with the formality the moment deserved, sat up straighter in his chair and shook Vernon's hand with a grip that was weaker than it had once been but no less firm in what it meant. "You take care of my girl," Harold said, looking at him with those steady eyes. "I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that," Vernon said. Harold nodded once, and that was enough. They were married in June of 1880 at the small white church on the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, which Reverend Aldrich had been building and expanding for 3 years, and which was now properly finished and had pews enough for the town's growing congregation. The wedding was simple and genuine, which was the only kind that Inez would have wanted. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered specially, a fine ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers that Pearl Gantry had gathered that morning from the fields south of town. Vernon stood at the front of the church in his good coat and watched her come down the aisle on her father's arm, Harold moving slowly but with enormous dignity, and something happened in Vernon's chest that was so large and complete that he had no name for it and simply stood with it and was grateful. She was beautiful, but it was not her beauty that struck him, or not only that. It was the look on her face, composed and clear and certain, the look she wore when she knew exactly what she was doing and why, and the fact that she was looking at him with that look, that she had measured everything and counted everything and arrived at him as the answer. He would not forget that look as long as he lived. Reverend Aldrich married them with words that were straightforward and sincere, and Louis Corrals, standing with a group of his family near the left side of the church, was grinning so broadly that Vernon almost laughed out loud when he caught his eye. Pearl Gantry was crying with the uninhibited generosity of someone who cried freely and did not consider it any kind of weakness. Harold Ramsey sat in the front row with his lap blanket despite the June warmth, and his expression was something Vernon would describe, if asked, as peaceful. The town came to the reception in the lot behind the church, and there was food that half the women of Caldwell had contributed and music from a fiddle player, named McCarthy, who knew every dance tune ever written west of Missouri and several that had originated somewhere considerably more questionable. Vernon danced with his wife, which was a phrase he tried in his head 2 or 3 times throughout the evening with the pleased and slightly dazed quality of a man still adjusting to a remarkable change in his circumstances. She danced well, which he had not known before. She moved with the same precision she brought to everything, but there was something looser in it too, something freer, and when the fiddle picked up and the tempo quickened and she laughed at something he said, that bright, uncontained laugh, he thought that he had understood very little about happiness before this particular evening. They moved into the house on the Boone land after the wedding, Inez riding out each morning to run the store and returning in the evenings, and her father remaining in the rooms at the back of the store where he had been comfortable for years. The arrangement was not perfect, but it was workable, and the 3 of them had dinner together several evenings a week at either the store or the house, and Harold improved somewhat in the summer months, the warmth seeming to agree with him. Vernon discovered things about Inez in the daily proximity of marriage that he had not known, and that delighted him in ways he had not anticipated. She read before sleep, propped against the pillow with a concentration that blocked out the entire world, and if he asked her what she was reading, she would tell him the whole plot without looking up. She was a meticulous cook when she had the time and energy for it, but she was entirely unbothered on the evenings she didn't, and they ate whatever was available without ceremony. She hummed to herself when she was working on something that fully occupied her hands but not her mind, a low, unconscious melody that changed depending on her mood. She was stubborn in the specific way of people who are usually right, which meant her stubbornness was irritating approximately 30% of the time and entirely correct the remaining 70. He told her this. She said, without looking up from her book, "I'll concede the 30%. He laughed. She turned a page. He thought in the quiet of those first married months, the luckiest man in Caldwell, Kansas. The summer moved into another autumn, and the cattle drive season came again, and Vernon had a decision to make. He had been managing his land and his cattle without going on the long drives for 2 years now, but his herd was growing, and there was good money in a drive north, and he had contacts in Dodge City who wanted to buy at good prices. But going north meant weeks away, which was not what he wanted. He solved it the way he had learned to solve things, by thinking carefully, asking the right people, and being honest about what he needed. He hired 2 experienced cowboys, a man named Tobias Wells and a taciturn but deeply competent Texan named Rafe Denton, to drive his portion of a combined herd north with a group of other small ranchers who were pooling their cattle for the drive. He paid them well and gave them clear instructions and trusted them to do the job, and he stayed in Caldwell, and the drive came back with good returns that put him solidly ahead for the next year. He put some of those returns into expanding the house, because he and Inez had spoken carefully about the future and about the family they intended to build, and the house needed another room. Harold Ramsey declined through the autumn and into the winter of 1880. His heart, the doctor said, was wearing out in the way hearts did in men of Harold's age and constitution, and there was nothing to be done beyond keeping him comfortable and well-tended. Inez took this information with the composed, practical grief of someone who had been watching it coming and had already made her peace with parts of it, though not with all of it. She cried privately in the way she did most things, without making anyone else manage it for her. But Vernon had learned to recognize when she was carrying something heavy, and he had learned the difference between when she needed space to carry it herself and when she needed someone to stand beside her while she carried it. He was learning to read her the way she had always read other people, with patience and attention, and the willingness to wait for the true meaning behind the visible expression. He sat with her one November night by the fireplace when the wind was going hard against the windows and she had been very quiet all evening, and he said nothing, and she eventually leaned against him without speaking, and he put his arm around her and they watched the fire together until the wind eased. "He's proud of you," Vernon said eventually. "He told me so 2 Sundays ago." She was quiet for a moment. "He told me the same about you," she said. "Did he?" "He said you came back every season with a better offer, and that made you a man of character." She tilted her head to look at him. "He appreciated that you didn't give up, but that you weren't foolish about it. He said a man who keeps trying without becoming desperate has got the right idea about how to earn something worth having." Vernon looked at the fire. "I think it was less calculation than it sounds," he admitted. "I just couldn't figure out how to want anything else." She reached up and put her hand on his jaw and turned his face toward hers, and the look in her eyes was the most complete and particular look she had ever given him. "I'm glad you kept coming back," she said. He kissed her, and outside the wind came up again, and the fire burned warm and steady, and everything in the world was exactly where it needed to be. Harold Ramsey died in February of 1881, on a cold, clear morning when the sky was bright blue and the world looked deceivingly kind. He went quietly in his sleep, which the doctor said was the best way, and which Inez said was exactly what her father would have chosen, because he had always been a man of good sense. They buried him in the Caldwell Cemetery beside Clara, who had been there since 1875. The town came to the funeral with the fullness that a beloved man draws at the end of a good life, and there were more people than fit inside the church, and the overflow stood outside in the cold February air with hats held against their chests. Vernon stood beside Inez through all of it, and she was composed and gracious and thanked everyone personally, and she did not break until they were home that evening and alone, and then she broke thoroughly and he held her for a long time and let her. He was a good man, she said when she had cried herself dry. The best kind, Vernon agreed. The kind that built something real and left it to people who would keep it. She lifted her face and looked at him, red-eyed and steady. The store is ours now, she said. His name is still on it. I want to keep it. Then we keep it, he said, simple as that. She nodded once and pressed her face against his shoulder again, and he held her in the firelight while the February night settled cold and quiet outside, and thought about what it meant to hold something worth holding. The spring of 1881 brought new life in the way springs do. The cattle multiplied, the horse partnership with Ernesto expanded, and Inez ran Ramsey's dry goods with the same steady competence she always had, with Pearl Gantry now working full days, and a young man named Robert Higgs helping with the heavy lifting. The store's name remained Ramsey's, because Harold had built it, and because the name meant something in Caldwell that was worth maintaining. Vernon had suggested it himself, and Inez had looked at him with an expression he was deeply familiar with by now, the one that meant she had been thinking exactly the same thing and was glad they agreed. He filed the paperwork to add both their names to the deed, Inez Ramsey Boone and Vernon Boone, equal partners, and when the document came back from the county office, he brought it home and laid it on the table, and she read it and looked up with something in her eyes that was quieter than happiness and deeper than satisfaction. "Thank you," she said. "It was never just mine to offer," he said. That summer, Inez told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the evening after supper, setting down her cup of coffee and looking at him with a careful directness that alerted him that something significant was coming before she said the words. He sat very still for a moment when she told him. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands in his, the way he had taken them the day she had said yes in the store, and she looked up at him with that bright, clear look. "Are you well?" He said, because this was his first thought and it felt more important than anything else. "I am very well," she said. "The doctor says everything looks good." He let out a breath. "Then I am the most fortunate man in the state of Kansas," he said. She laughed, that full bright laugh, and he sat down beside her and they talked until late into the night about names and rooms and what it would mean, and the house felt like it had expanded somehow, simply from the conversation. Ellison Chalk came back to Caldwell in the autumn of 1881. He came back with a lawyer this time, and the lawyer had documents. The documents, as Inez explained to Vernon that evening with the flat, careful tone she used when she was very angry and managing it, claimed that there was an error in the original deed to the land on which the store sat, an error that predated Harold Ramsey's purchase, and that Chalk had acquired the rights to the underlying claim from an estate sale in Wichita. "Is it legitimate?" Vernon asked, reading the papers. "I don't know," she said, which was the honest answer. "I need to know. I need to see the original deed records." Vernon put on his coat. "I'll ride to Wichita tomorrow and get the county records." She looked at him. "The baby is not due for another 3 months. I'll be back in a week." He looked at her steadily. "I am not letting Ellison Chalk take your father's store on a paperwork claim without finding out if he actually has a leg to stand on. I'll write you a letter of authority," she said, and went for her writing materials with the purpose of general planning a campaign. He rode to Wichita the next morning and spent 3 days in the county land office going through deed records, with a patience that the clerk there found somewhat remarkable, and that Vernon had learned from 2 years of watching Inez. What he found was what he had suspected. The claim Chalk's lawyer had based his documents on was a fraudulent transfer. The underlying deed from the alleged estate sale had been altered. The date changed from 1866 to 1860 to make it appear to predate Harold Ramsey's legitimate purchase. He brought the records back to Caldwell and to a lawyer of their own, a man named Joshua Crane who had come to Caldwell from Ohio the previous year, and who was sharper than he appeared, and Crane reviewed everything carefully and confirmed Vernon's reading. The claim was fraudulent. Chalk either knew it and was attempting a deliberate swindle, or had been deceived by whoever sold him the supposed rights, and in either case it had no legal standing. Crane sent a letter to Chalk's lawyer with the precise documentation attached, and that was the last they heard of Ellison Chalk and his claim on Harold Ramsey's store. The man did not come back to Caldwell after that. Vernon thought about him occasionally, not with anger but with a certain grim satisfaction at the way honest record-keeping and genuine attention to detail had been the thing that protected them. He told this to Inez one evening, and she said, without looking up from the sock she was darning, "My father always said that a good ledger keeps more enemies at bay than a good gun." "Your father was a wise man," Vernon said. "He was," she agreed. "I try to remember that every day." Their son was born in January of 1882, on a night that was cold but not brutally so, with the help of the midwife Mrs. Hendricks, and with Vernon sitting in the front room of the house listening to everything with the focused intensity of a man who cannot help because there is nothing to be helped, and who is therefore entirely at the mercy of the situation. When Mrs. Hendricks came to tell him it was done and they were both well, he stood up so fast he knocked over the lamp he had been sitting beside and had to catch it, and Mrs. Hendricks laughed and said she had seen that reaction many times and it never got less funny. Inez was propped against the pillows with her dark hair loose and her eyes tired and brilliant, and the small person in the crook of her arm was the most extraordinary thing Vernon had ever seen, which surprised him somewhat because he had thought he had seen enough of the world to be fairly unsurprisable. "He looks like you," Inez said. Vernon sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very small and very red and had a remarkable amount of dark hair considering his recent arrival in the world. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, and the small fist closed around it with a grip that was absurdly strong for something so new. "What do you want to call him?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. He could tell by the quality of her pause. "Harold," she said, "for my father." Vernon looked at her. "Harold Vernon Boone," he said. She smiled. "That is too many names." "Harold Boone, then, short and solid." "Harold Boone," she agreed, and looked down at her son with an expression that was so full and complete that Vernon had to look away for a moment, because it was almost too much to look at directly. Harold Boone was a good baby in the way that some babies are, not easy exactly, because no newborn is truly easy, but straightforward about his needs, and satiable once those needs were met. He grew quickly and had his mother's eyes from the beginning, dark and direct, and his father's long legs, which became apparent earlier than anyone expected. The store continued to prosper. Vernon's cattle herd had grown to nearly 70 head by 1882, and the horse operation with Ernesto Corrals had developed a solid reputation that brought buyers from considerable distances. Louis Corrals, now 22, had taken on more of the day-to-day management of the horse side of the operation and was proving to be as good a businessman as his father had predicted he would be. The town of Caldwell itself was changing, growing. The railroad had come through the area, and with it more people, more commerce, more noise and possibility. New families were arriving from the east and from the south and from across the territories, people of many backgrounds looking for the same things that had always brought people west: land, opportunity, the chance to build something that was theirs. It was not always peaceful. There were disputes over land and water, and the slow business of who had rights to what, and the injustices that had always threaded through the West continued to thread through it. Mexican families like the Corrals pushed to the edges of what was considered legitimate black families who had come out from the South after the war, finding that Kansas had its own particular architecture of unfairness, despite the promises that had been made and the laws that had been passed. Vernon and Inez talked about these things in their evenings at home because they were real and because they lived among them. Ernesto Corrales had once told Vernon, with the quiet clarity of a man who stated only facts, that there were buyers who had refused to do business with him until they found out he was partnered with Vernon Boone, which told them everything they needed to know about how such men valued their business compared to their prejudices. Vernon had been furious in a contained way and had made certain that in all their subsequent dealings it was visible and clear that Ernesto was an equal partner, not an employee, and that any man who could not negotiate with that fact could find another arrangement. Inez ran the store with the same principle. She extended credit equitably, ordered from suppliers who treated her equitably, and maintained the standard her mother and father had established of a store that served the whole community because the whole community was her community. When there were difficult conversations to be had about fairness, she had them directly and without drama, which meant they were usually had once, and then the matter was settled. Pearl Gantry married Robert Higgs in the summer of 1882, which Inez had predicted 2 years before and which surprised no one. Pearl cried at her own wedding with the same enthusiastic generosity she had applied to Inez's, which Robert found both entirely predictable and deeply endearing. The autumn of 1882 was good. The cattle market was strong, the store was healthy, the house was full and warm. Vernon had added a second room to accommodate Harold, who was crawling with impressive speed, and a complete absence of concern for his own safety that required someone's eye on him at all times. On a warm October evening, with Harold asleep and the dinner things cleared away, and the lamps burning low, Vernon and Inez sat on the porch in the particular comfortable quiet that belonged to people who had been together long enough to sit without needing to fill the silence, and who found the silence itself a kind of conversation. She leaned against his shoulder the way she did sometimes, her dark hair loose from its daytime arrangement, and he put his arm around her and looked out at his land, at the dark shapes of the cattle in the pasture and the horses in the corral and the creek catching the moonlight along the east edge. "We've built something," she said. "We have," he agreed. "My father would have been happy," she said, not sadly. As a fact offered and received, he would have. Vernon looked down at her. "Are you happy?" She turned and looked at him, that clear, direct look. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I am very happy." She paused. "Are you?" "Inez," he said. "I came back every season for 2 years with what I thought was a better offer, and every time I came back, you reminded me by your refusal that the real offer I was building toward was just this, a life that was worth living together. I didn't understand that clearly until you finally said yes, but looking back on it, you were right every single time." She was quiet for a moment. "You came back," she said. "That was the thing, you came back, and each time you were more the man I needed you to be. Not because you were changing to please me." She looked up at him. "Because you were becoming more fully yourself, and that was what I was waiting for." He kissed her then, in the October dark with the moonlight on the pasture and the creek running easy to the east, and it was the kiss of people who were entirely where they were supposed to be. The years moved on in the good way that good years do, marked not by drama, but by the accumulation of ordinary moments that add up, over time, to a life. Harold grew from a crawling marvel to a running one, and by his 3rd birthday was showing a particular interest in the horses that made Ernesto Corrales declare with satisfaction that the boy had good sense. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's long, easy walk, and a personality that was its own entirely original thing, curious and direct, and possessed of an opinion about almost everything that he expressed without reservation. In the spring of 1884, their second child was born. A daughter this time, arriving on an April morning when the wildflowers were coming up in the fields south of town, and she came into the world with a lot of opinions about the process and announced them at considerable volume, which Mrs. Hendricks said was a fine sign of good health. They named her Clara for Inez's mother, and Clara Boone was from her first weeks a person of strong preferences and bright eyes, and a smile that was entirely her own, wide and mischievous, showing up in unexpected moments. Harold, at 2.5, received his sister with a careful solemnity that gave way almost immediately to a proprietary interest. He wanted to look at her. He wanted to know about her. He wanted to show her the horses, which his parents gently deferred. The store had expanded by 1884. They had bought the building next door when its previous occupant moved his enterprise to Wichita, and Inez had knocked through the connecting wall and added a section for hardware and tools that served the growing population of homesteaders who needed supplies that had previously required a trip to Wichita or Dodge City. Robert Higgs managed the hardware side under Inez's oversight, and Pearl worked the general merchandise side with the cheerful competence of someone who genuinely liked the work. And between them, they had made Ramsey's Dry Goods and Hardware one of the best-stocked stores in the county. Vernon's cattle operation had grown to 120 head. The horse partnership with Ernesto had expanded into a breeding program for working ranch horses that sold well throughout the region. Louis Corrals, 26 now and recently married to a young woman named Adela who had come up from New Mexico Territory, and who was formidably smart and immediately beloved by Inez, had taken over the day-to-day running of the horse operation almost entirely, which freed Vernon to focus on the cattle management and on the various smaller enterprises. A hay operation, a modest contract for supplying grain to the Army fort 40 miles north, that had grown up around the core business. One evening in the summer of 1884, they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Harold asleep, Clara in her cradle nearby making the small sounds of a baby working through the business of existing, and the lamp burning yellow and warm on the table between them. Inez had her account books in front of her and Vernon had a map of the surrounding land spreads, and they were working in companionable parallel, the way they often did in the evenings. Vernon looked up from his map. He had been thinking about something for several days, and he had learned that the best time to bring something to Inez was not when she was in the middle of something else, but when she was in that focused half-attention that meant she had bandwidth for a new thought. "I want to talk about the land south of the creek," he said. She looked up. "The Sutton piece." "Sutton's selling. His son doesn't want the ranching life and he wants to go back to his family in Ohio." Vernon had heard this from Dutch Hollowell, who heard everything. 80 acres of good bottomland with reliable water. If we add that to what we have, we'd have the best water access on this side of the county. Inez put down her pen. She was thinking with that particular focused expression. "How much?" he told her. She looked at the account books and did arithmetic in her head with the speed that still impressed him after years of watching it. "We can do it," she said. "Not easily, but we can do it. It would be tight through the winter." "I know, but Dutch says the grass down there is deep." She looked at him. "Buy it," she said. "Good land is not often available twice." He smiled. "That is exactly what your father told me when I was deciding whether to buy the Calhoun land." She looked back at her books, but there was a smile on her face. "My father was right about most things," she said. "I've made my peace with that." They bought the Sutton land in September of 1884, which brought their total holdings to 240 acres, the creek running strong along the east boundary, and the new bottomland grass exactly as deep and good as Dutch Hollowell had said. Vernon rode the whole perimeter of their combined land one clear autumn morning, on a good horse with Harold in front of him in the saddle, the boy directing the horse with 3-year-old authority, and looked out at what two people had built from 40 acres and a dry goods store, and the particular stubbornness of coming back season after season with something more honest and real than the time before. Harold pointed at the creek. "Water," he said, with the gravity of someone stating an important observation. "That's right," Vernon said. "That's our water, good for the cattle and good for the grass." "Good," Harold agreed, satisfied. Vernon laughed and the sound went out across the autumn land. The years passed with the warmth of things that are working as they are meant to work. By 1886, Harold was 5 and attending the school that had been established at the east end of town. riding in each morning on a small roan pony that Ernesto had selected for him with great deliberation. Clara was too and entirely ungovernable in the most delightful way, having inherited her mother's certainty, and applied it to a 24-month-old's understanding of the world, which meant she had opinions about everything and the determination to act on them. There was a third child coming, Inez had told him in the spring, and Vernon had received the information with the same focused joy he had felt the first 2 times, the immediate first question being whether she was well and the answer being yes, very well. Louis Corrals and his wife Adela had their first child in 1885, a son they named Ernesto after his grandfather, and the old man Ernesto had gone very quiet in the particular way of men who do not cry easily and are managing something large. Vernon shook his hand afterward and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and Ernesto looked at him with eyes that were not quite dry and nodded once. The third Boone child arrived in October of 1886, another son. They named him William, for no family reason but simply because they both liked the name, and because Harold, consulted with 5-year-old seriousness, had approved it. William Boone arrived in the world with less drama than his sister and more than his brother, which seemed to Vernon to describe a generally reasonable position on a rival drama. Caldwell by 1886 was a proper town with a proper sense of itself. The wild period of the cattle trail days, when the Texas herds had come up through town and the saloons had been busy and the lawmen had had a different kind of work to do, was settling into something more domesticated, more established, more permanent. Families were the majority of the population now, not trail hands and drifters. There were 3 churches, 2 schools, a newspaper, a bank, several good stores including Ramsey's, a doctor's office, and the beginning of civic institutions that suggested a town that intended to persist. Vernon was on the town council by 1886, not because he had sought the position, but because Dutch Hollowell had proposed him and the vote had been unanimous, and when Vernon had told Inez she had said, without looking up from her accounts, "Of course they elected you. You're the most straightforwardly capable person in the room in most rooms." He had thought about that for a long time afterward, because it was the same thing he had once said about her. He told her so. She looked up from her accounts, a slow smile crossed her face. "Good," she said. "We are well matched then." "I've thought so for some time," he said. She threw an apple at him which he caught. By the autumn of 1887, Harold was 6 and reading well, Clara was 3 and fierce, and William was almost a year old and working determinedly on the problem of standing upright on his own, which he solved definitively on a September morning by taking 4 steps across the kitchen floor and looking back at his parents with an expression of such complete self-satisfaction that Vernon had to leave the room briefly to compose himself. The cattle herd stood at 180 head. The horse operation was one of the most respected in the county. The store was the heartbeat of the town's commerce, still bearing Harold Ramsey's name, still anchored by Inez's steady and meticulous hand. One November evening, with all 3 children in bed, and the house quiet and the fire going strong against the first serious cold of the season, Inez and Vernon sat in the 2 good chairs they had placed facing the fireplace, the chairs that had been bought the first winter after they married when Inez had said, with the practical romance that was entirely characteristic of her, that if you were going to sit by a fire together for the rest of your lives you ought to have good chairs. She was reading. He was not reading but was looking at the fire and thinking about nothing in particular, which was one of the profound luxuries of a life well established. He could hear the wind outside and the creak of the house, and faintly, from the direction of the corrals place down the road, a dog. "Vernon," she said. He looked over. She had set her book down and was looking at the fire, and her expression had the quality of someone about to say something that had been waiting to be said. "Do you remember when you first came into the store?" she said. "I remember every detail of it," he said, which was entirely true. "I knew before you left that day," she said. That's what I never told you. She turned and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. I knew from the way you took no for an answer and didn't argue about it that you were a man who understood something about how to treat a person. I didn't know if you'd come back, but I knew if you came back it would be different from the other men who had come before. A pause. So I told Pearl to tell me if she heard you were in town again, because I wanted to know. Vernon looked at her for a long moment. You knew before I came back the second time. I was paying attention, she said simply. I told you, I don't know people the way my mother did, but I watch carefully. He reached over and took her hand the way he had taken it the first time, and she turned it and held his. You watched me for an entire year before you let me know you were watching, he said. I watch everything before I commit to it, she said. You knew that about me. I did, he said. I'm glad I kept coming back. I'm glad you kept coming back too, she said, though your first offer was genuinely not good enough. He laughed. No, it wasn't. Your second one was better. But this, she said, looking around at their house, at the fire and the children sleeping in the back rooms and the land stretching out in the dark beyond the walls. This is the offer that was worth waiting for. And you built it before you asked. You didn't ask and then build. You built first and asked second. She looked back at him. That was the thing, Vernon. That was the thing that told me who you were. He looked at her in the firelight. This woman who had turned him down with the cleanest honesty he had ever been given, who had watched him without telling him she was watching, who had counted everything carefully before committing, and who had, once she committed, never looked back. This woman who ran a store and kept a ledger and raised 3 children, and managed a cattle partnership, and sat on the boards of 2 civic organizations, and read a book every 2 weeks, and had opinions about all of them. This woman who had become, over the course of the 9 years since a morning in a dry goods store, when she had redirected him toward the peaches and the tobacco without even fully looking up, the absolute center and context of his entire life. I love you, he said simply, because it was the whole truth, and the whole truth was the only thing that had ever worked with her. She squeezed his hand. I love you, she said. I have for a long time, longer than you know. The fire burned low and warm. Outside, the November wind moved over the Boone land, over the good grass and the creek, and the cattle settled in the draw and the horses in their corrals, over the 240 acres that had been built from 40 and from a plan, and from the particular refusal of 2 people to settle for something less than what was real and right. Harold Boone, age 7, came downstairs the following morning with his boots on the wrong feet and an elaborate theory about horses that he had developed during the night and needed to explain to both his parents immediately. And Clara Boone, age 4, appeared behind him with her hair entirely undone, and a piece of biscuit from last night's supper that she had apparently been saving for morning. And William Boone, age 1, made his presence known from the direction of the back room with a series of sounds that were not yet words, but were unmistakably declarative. Inez went to get William, pausing on the way to set Harold's boots right and to lift Clara, biscuit and all, and kiss her on the forehead. And Vernon put the coffee on and corrected Harold's boot situation and listened to the horse theory with full attention and thought that the morning was perfect. Not perfect in the way of things that have no trouble in them. Perfect in the way of things that are exactly what they were built to be. Outside, the winter light was coming up over the Kansas plains, clear and cold and wide, the way it came up in that part of the country, filling the whole sky with the particular honesty of a place that had no pretensions and a great deal of room. The Boone land lay under it, the creek catching the light, the cattle moving in the morning cold, the house sending up a thread of smoke from the chimney that stood straight and steady in the still air. In the spring of 1888, Inez told him there would be a 4th child, and Vernon received the news with joy and the immediate question of whether she was well, and she said she was very well, and the morning continued. They were sitting on the porch that evening. The porch he had extended the previous summer because Inez liked to sit outside in the evenings, and the original porch had been insufficient for a family of 5 going on 6. when Harold came out with a question. He was 7 now, nearly 8, and the questions he asked were the kind that required genuine thought. "Papa," he said, settling onto the step in the way he did, knees up, arms around them, "how did you and Mama decide to get married?" Vernon looked at Inez. She looked back at him with a small, precise smile, waiting to see how he would answer. "I came to the store where your mother worked," Vernon said, "and I asked her to marry me." Harold considered this. "Did she say yes?" "She said no," Vernon said. Harold's eyes went wide with the particular pleasure of unexpected information. "Why?" "Because she didn't know me well enough yet," Vernon said. "So I spent a year trying to be worth knowing." Harold turned and looked at his mother. "Did it work?" Inez reached out and tucked a strand of hair out of his face, the gesture so habitual and tender that she did it without thinking. "He came back every season with a better offer," she said. "Eventually his offer was good enough." Harold looked back at his father with a 7-year-old's weighing of information. "How many times did you have to come back?" "Twice," Vernon said. "But the second time I came back with 2 years of work and a finished house and a plan for the rest of my life. The offer had improved considerably." Harold nodded, apparently satisfied with the economics of this. "I think that was smart," he said. "Your mother thought so too," Vernon said. "Eventually." Inez looked at him over Harold's head with the look that still did to him what it had always done, the full, bright, certain look that she gave him in her completely unguarded moments, the look that said she had measured everything and arrived at him and would arrive at him again. He smiled at her. She smiled back. Harold scrambled off the step and went back inside, already thinking about something else. The conversation filed away with all the other things he was collecting toward an understanding of the world. Clara's voice rose briefly from somewhere inside the house, declarative and cheerful. William made a sound of either protest or enthusiasm. At his age, the two were nearly indistinguishable. The spring evening settled around the house. The grass was coming up green across the Boone land, and the creek was running high and fast from the snowmelt, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was making its precise, clear argument to the sky. Vernon Boone, 38 years old, cattleman and landholder, and husband and father and member of the Caldwell Town Council and partner to Ernesto Corrals in a horse operation that was known throughout the county, sat on his porch with his wife beside him, and listened to the ordinary, extraordinary sound of his life going on all around him. He had been turned down once. He had come back better. He had come back with something that was not just an offer of land and money and intentions, but with himself, worked and proven and real. And she had seen it because she always saw clearly, and she had said yes because she was the most honest person he knew. And every morning since, he had woken up in the house he had built and thought that the refusal had been the best thing that had ever happened to him, because it had made him build something worth offering. The fourth Boone child arrived in October of 1888, a second daughter they named Emma, small and serious and watchful in a way that made Inez say, holding her the first night, that she had her grandmother Clara's way of looking at the world. Vernon looked at this new small person and felt the same thing he had felt 3 times before, that enormous, nameless fullness. Harold was allowed to hold her, seated carefully in the big chair with his arms positioned just so, and he did it with a concentration so intense that Mrs. Hendricks laughed and said she had seen grown men look less responsible. Clara looked at the baby with the slightly proprietary air of an older sister deciding her position. William, 2 years old and recently opinionated about most things, pointed and said baby, with enormous self-satisfaction at having correctly identified the category. And Inez, propped against her pillows with the tired brilliance she always had in those first hours, looked at Vernon across the room with her dark, steady eyes, and he looked back at her. And the whole long story of how they had come to be in this particular room with these particular people around them was present in that look, understood and held and grateful. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, as he always did. He took her hand. "All right," he said, as he always asked. "All right," she said, as she always answered. Outside, the October land was turning toward winter, the grass going gold and the sky wide and clear, and the creek running steady along the east edge of everything they had built together. The cattle were in the near pasture. The horses moved in the corral. The smoke went up from the chimney into the cold, bright air. Vernon Boone had come into Ramsey's dry goods on a spring morning 10 years before with $40 in his pocket and nothing particular to offer. He had been turned down with such clean, honest accuracy that it had changed the direction of his life. He had come back with something better and been turned down again and understood why and come back better still. He had learned in the years of building and returning that an offer worth making is not made once and then forced. It is built with the time and patience and honesty it deserves, and then it is made, and if it is the right offer and the right person, it is received. He had learned this from Inez Ramsey, who had known from the beginning what she was waiting for and had waited without apology and without compromise for the thing that was real. And here it was. Here they were. The house and the land and the children and the store bearing her father's name and the partnership with Ernesto and the good horses in the corral and the creek running along the east boundary and the particular sound of a family going about the serious and joyful business of being alive together. It was everything. It was, in the way of things that are genuinely sufficient, more than enough. Emma made the small sound that meant she was ready for her mother's attention, and Harold looked up with the alert readiness of an elder brother, and Clara said something to William that made him laugh, and Inez turned to attend to her new daughter, and Vernon sat for a moment in the center of all of it and was completely and entirely at home.